This is the Board of County Commissioners Board Work Session. It is Wednesday, October 19th, 2022. It is 11:07 a.m. This is set to go until 11:45? Until noon? Okay. Sorry, the agenda set up.
That's it.
Until noon today. This is a hybrid meeting. We're in Building 1, Room 280 for public virtual attendance. You may follow along on the Thurston County YouTube channel. I'm Carolina Mejia. I'm the chair of the board. To my right is Vice Chair Ty Menser. Commissioner Gary Edwards will be joining us via Zoom a little bit later on. He does have a retreat that he is attending. County Manager Ramiro Chavez in the boardroom, as well as Assistant County Manager Robin Campbell. We also, joining us via Zoom, we have Interim Public Health and Social Services Director, Kurt Harden, and as well as other staff members joining us for the Regional Housing Structure Update. Tom, am I handing this straight off to you?
If you'd like, I don't know if Ramiro, if you wanted to provide any context, or you want me to just jump in.
Go right ahead, Tom. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, and good morning, commissioners. So we have two items that we wanted to kind of talk to you about today. The first one is to provide an update on the Regional Housing Council governance structure. There has been several meetings over the past few months looking at developing a new interim governance structure, and so we wanted to update you on where that is and kind of next steps going forward. And then following Commissioner Mejia's request at agenda setting yesterday, we wanted to present to you a possible project idea on the Franz Anderson property that the county and city of Olympia jointly purchased earlier this year with ARPA funds. So we sent, I don't know if you have both presentations in front of you. We sent the, great. So what we'll do is I will, if I can share my screen, if that's appropriate, just jump into the RHC governance structure review. And if there's any questions, please, I can't always see everyone. So let me know if there are questions as I go along. So providing a little context for the RHC governance structure, this really came out of the retreat that was held in May between RHC members as well as members of the Housing Action Team. And the goal was to create a short-term governance structure for the Regional Housing Council that could be implemented kind of immediately, while a longer-term structure of a more independent agency is under consideration. So looking kind of a maybe 2-3 year kind of time frame for the structure, with the guiding principles of really looking to honor the work that was done at that Regional Housing Council Housing Action Team retreat, to build trust, to support meaningful engagement with HAT members and subject matter experts in the RHC process, to incorporate those with lived experience into RHC processes, incorporate the requirement, the Home Fund Advisory Board that was passed by ordinance, and merging the Olympia Home Fund with the new County Home Fund Advisory Board, providing greater clarity and transparency to funding decisions, some justification or structure for staff support, and then really to inform what amendments need to happen to the Regional Housing Council interlocal agreement. So what the RHC has been discussing for the past couple months, in which they approved at their last, or 2 meetings ago, their end of September meeting, was this high-level organizational structure for the Regional Housing Council. So in the top corner, you have the RHC itself, which is comprised of elected officials. So as a reminder, there's an elected official from the county, Olympia, Lacey, Tumwater, and the city of Yelm. One of the changes that I think you're aware of is the Housing Action Team is going to be there'll be 2 non-voting members from the Housing Action Team as representatives sitting on the RHC. So that was a substantial change to the structure from what it is currently. And then there's jurisdictional staff who are also non-voting members who support the RHC. There will be an RHC executive team or admin team, which exists, but this will be a little bit more robust than what currently exists. Includes the RHC chair and vice chair, the RHC manager, the advisory team, staff leads, and I'll talk about the advisory teams in a minute, a communications lead, as well as an admin person. So it's similar to what currently exists, but a few more positions will be added to that to support. We have a technical team made up of jurisdictional staff that meet on a weekly basis that will continue to exist. And that really is going to provide the conduit between the RHC executive, which will set the agendas for the RHC, and these advisory boards. And so one of the main changes that's coming out of this structure is the creation of these two advisory boards, an affordable housing advisory board and a homeless services advisory board. So the Affordable Housing Advisory Board is really intended to be a one place where all of the capital dollars that come into the region, where priorities can be made, applications can be reviewed, and recommendations can be forwarded out of this board. So in addition to looking at the Olympia Home Fund and the countywide home fund, this board would also look at our federal home investment partnership program, the local 1406 sales tax, revenue, as well as the 2060 document recording fee revenue, all of which is used to support affordable housing and capital projects. That idea of these advisory boards would then have not only just representatives from the Housing Action Team, but other subject matter experts and community members to engage in discussions around the use of these funds and to make recommendations. So that's specific, that's required by ordinance for the home funds, but we added those additional funding sources. And so the idea was to create a parallel advisory board that's really focused on the homeless services funds as well. So these are our local document recording fee, 2163, consolidated homeless grant, HEN, some of the new 1277 funding, the human services funds, those other funds that come into the county on a region-wide basis to be used for homeless services. So similarly to the Affordable Housing Board, this would be comprised of kind of representatives from the Housing Action Team, a mix from various jurisdictions, and then other subject matter experts to make those recommendations. The Housing Action Team is really there kind of to support these advisory boards as from a, representatives from the Housing Action Team will sit on these boards, but also we recognize that the Housing Action Team has these other sub-teams, the Affordable Housing Team, the Data Work Group, Homeless Housing Hub, the Rental Housing Work Group, and the Senior Housing Team that all also support this entire system. So it was important to kind of include that here. We have the Lived Experience Steering Committee represented here. This is kind of just getting developed. We've hired a consultant who is helping us put this together. I'm going to have Keely talk about this a little bit more later. So the exact role of that group is still being worked out, but we wanted to reflect it here that they will have an opportunity to kind of participate in the process, and their voice is very important to this process. And then kind of off on the side here, kind of the staff that are supporting the work of the RHC is really kind of our Office of Housing and Homeless Prevention. So just looking at the staff that will be needed. And so not going into a lot of detail here, we have some requests that have been made around additional staffing positions that you've seen. So we've talked through kind of how this would look from a funding cycle point of view and kind of policy. So there's some charts there that kind of overlay or kind of lay out a high level process for how those would work. And I've kind of talked through the roles and responsibilities at a high level. Kind of really next steps are we're in the process of finalizing the interlocal agreement between Olympia and Thurston County to kind of combine our home funds. So that is in the final stages of being approved. And so we would hope to bring that forward to you shortly. I don't know if Ramiro has any new updates on the status of that, but I know there's just some final legal language being worked on that that's been agreed to in principle, I believe. And then next steps are really creating these advisory boards. So we have a draft charter that we are working on to kind of lay out the parameters for how these boards would work, what the members would look like, what are the terms, and whatnot. So we're hoping to bring that and have approval from the RHC within the next month or so for those draft charters. And then we'll be looking to recruit for members for those advisory boards with the expectation that these boards would begin working in the first half of 2023. We're also looking at, with these changes, incorporating those into the Regional Housing Council interlocal agreement. So we've started kind of early in the process of identifying what amendments are needed to that RHC ILA to incorporate these changes. And that will include more specifically defining the roles of those HAT members who will sit on the RHC at the RHC level. So that's some immediate next steps that will be happening over the next couple months. And then long term is, and we're just still in the early stages of discussions with the RHC along this, is considering or exploring the options of hiring consultants to really look at a long-term structure for the Regional Housing Council. There's some interest for having a more independent, I don't know what more independent means, that's still to be determined and explored, but looking to bring someone to explore kind of a long-term organizational structure for the RHC. And so that would be kind of activities that really would be happening in 2023 is what we've been looking at, but several steps in terms of whether to identify funding, what would be the scope for that consultant still needs to be determined. So just at the early stages of thinking about that. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Keely real quick to talk a little bit more about the Lived Experience Steering Committee and its role in all of this.
Excellent. Thank you, Tom. Good morning, commissioners. So in 2021, you'll recall that the Regional Housing Council did approve $150,000 set aside for us to find a consultant or an agency that could help us address racial disparities, which is called out in our homeless crisis response system as a required outcome stated by the Department of Commerce. So we did issue an RFP, as you recall, in 2021. And the idea was we landed on creating a steering committee that would, we created a little bit broad so that that steering committee with people from lived experience could help participate in the design of it, and it could meet the needs of those with lived experience as well as help with the homeless crisis response system. And one of those very specific outcomes was to look at our strategies written within the 5-year plan, specifically those designed to address racial disparities and to vet them or to give us guidance on either improving those strategies or changing them altogether. And then likewise, in the future, as they've been formed, sit on decision-making bodies and action bodies. So sitting on task force, et cetera, where action or decisions are taken, like the Hazardous Weather Task Force or the Outreach Workers League, and then also to eventually help inform policy and to make policy recommendations. So Confluence Consulting Northwest was our agency, our consulting agency that we did choose to move forward with these activities. And they have been active since March of this year. And as of this Monday, they have successfully recruited 10 individuals with lived expertise, many of whom are actually currently experiencing homelessness. And they are starting their first meeting this week with them in person. It was deliberately intended for this steering committee to take agency and ownership over the way in which it was developed and the duties and tasks in which they will participate in. As these are individuals with lived experience, there will be some time to get them oriented to working together and to, just frankly become very comfortable with our system and understanding it and understanding, who is who makes decisions, what are all these meetings and how can we plug in? It's really important to the consultants. And I think it's becoming common practice that these individuals with lived experience be compensated for their time, especially because it is a significant haul to for those who are not necessarily used to sitting in meetings and moving through bureaucratic processes, that they do get compensated for their expertise, which is for this particular committee, belonging to a marginalized group or a group that's not often that's overrepresented in the homeless crisis response system and underrepresented at the tables where decisions are made. So our Black, Indigenous, people of color, and those with lived experience or lived expertise in homelessness. So they're just launching right now, and they will be meeting at least 6 times over the next year. Each of these lived experience steering committee members have committed to a year's worth of efforts, and they also will be supported by the individuals who nominated to be a part of the steering committee. So there was a nomination process. So those are members within the homeless crisis response system. So that's kind of where the steering committee is at. It's not necessarily it doesn't belong to the Regional Housing Council. It's designed to serve the system, the homeless crisis response system. So I'm happy to take any questions about that, but that's kind of where we're at with that committee.
Thank you.
Questions?
Commissioner Edwards? Questions, sir?
Yes. How much are you talking about when you talk about compensation? Oh, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Yes, they are paying these individuals $25 per hour.
Can you hear me okay?
You're skipping a little bit, Commissioner.
And what is that?
We cannot hear you very well, Commissioner, sorry.
Okay.
Really?
Stretch like that.
Maybe I should call. What's chances you could give me a call on this? Didn't realize they didn't have good service.
Yeah,
We can hear you now.
Maybe we can follow up with your questions after the briefing, Commissioner, if that works.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, thank
Let's
you.
do that.
Yeah.
Sounds good.
Thank you.
Commissioner Menzer, questions?
Okay, my initial comment is holy cow. And I'm trying to figure out these advisory boards. So looking at this chart, I'm not even gonna touch the lived experience steering committee. But let me look at the other 2 boxes. Homeless Services Advisory Board, Affordable Housing Advisory Board. Now on a later slide, it says Home Fund and Homeless Services Advisory Board. So am I to conclude that the Affordable Housing Advisory Board is the same as the Home Fund Advisory Board?
That is correct.
Okay, so I would get the terminology sort of figured out, so it's not any more confusing than it already is.
It already
because
is.
It's already pretty confusing. Why then in that box do I not see any listing of, I thought we were going to utilize the trained, engaged, and subject matter experts that were already on the Olympia's Home Fund Advisory Board, but I don't see them listed here. I hope we're not sending them to the curb, because that was the whole point of the MOU with Olympia.
Yeah, and so certainly not. And so in the interlocal agreement, 1/3 of the members of that Affordable Housing Advisory Board will be from Olympia and represent Olympia. And the intent is to kind of, for folks on currently the Olympia Home Fund Advisory Board, some of those would move over to the this countywide Affordable Housing Board. So that is really the details of that are being kind of spelled out in that interlocal agreement. So we didn't, at this level, we kept it just at a higher level, but there certainly is the intent in the draft charter goes into that 1/3 of the members would represent Olympia. And kind of our hope and expectation is those subject matter experts would carry over from the current Olympia Home Fund Board.
Okay.
However, not everyone on the Olympia Home Fund Board will be able to continue on just from if 1/3 of the members, and they have, I believe, 8 or 9 members, we're looking to create a 8 to 14 member board. So
Sure.
it will not everyone will be able to continue.
Sure. Well, I would definitely change that box to indicate that this connects to the home fund and that you just what you said, 1/3 members slated from Olympia, because if I'm looking for that, I don't see it. If I'm a City of Olympia official, that I don't want them to feel like they got, that we're violating the spirit of the MOU that we signed with them. And then just managing, it seems like everywhere I turn, and I don't mean it to be disparaging, these can be really valuable, super important. I can name examples, but it seems like everywhere I turn, it's a new community advisory board popping up in the last few months. And now you've got 3 underneath this, and just how to manage all of that and make it work smoothly or effectively is something that I would need to be more clearly explained to me. Because that just seems unmanageable, what's described here.
Yeah, I think we have experience doing this, kind of maybe not kind of in this way, but I think because this is really going to be driven around our funding processes, and so historically we have engaged with the Housing Action Team around helping us to set priorities. And we've had review committees in terms of reviewing applications, which these groups will be doing. So we've heard a lot of feedback from the providers that they want to be more engaged, they want to be more transparent in how priorities are set and how funding decisions are made. And so this is really an effort to be responsive to that feedback we've heard from local partners and stakeholders. And I think we have processes in place that we've used historically, maybe not involving kind of these specific people, but with how we kind of go through our priority setting process, issuing our RFPs and application reviews processes that we can build with these advisory boards to follow through and make recommendations up through the Regional Housing Council that will eventually come to you for decisions. So it's certainly, I don't think we're we're not under any illusions that this will be challenging, but I do think it is manageable. It will take some time to kind of get us up and running.
The Housing Action Team, as a component of Thurston Thrives, I've always thought of as a community group. Collective impact is what Thurston Thrives is all about. So you've got that, and you've got that embedded in both of these others. And then you've got the leads of each of these 3 committees embedded in the RHC Executive Administrative Board. I mean, it's layer upon layer of interlocking bureaucracy, I'll call it that. It's not exactly bureaucracy because they're not government officials, they're community, but it's a community advisory bureaucracy that just seems like, it just seems so complex. Like this is the kind of thing that happens over time organically because of individual relationships and people want to be involved. This is not the kind of thing I expect to see like out of the gate. Like, here's what we think is gonna work with this incredible complexity. Like, this is the kind of complexity you evolve after a decade of working with community groups and having, different things happen. But to come out of the gate with a structure this interwoven and complex, I think is setting yourself up for a lot of problems. Just my 2 cents.
You're absolutely on point in terms of seeing this at first, and this is probably the same reaction some elected officials and some members of the RHC had on this. But this is really the result of engaging all those groups as to how the best structure will be. And I believe the next step will be to define the roles and responsibilities of each of those groups. I think is going to gel a little bit better this structure. Just to give an example, the whole argument of having the bottom box, to have the Housing Action Team and having the arrows to those 2 teams, 2 meetings worth of conversations at the Regional Housing Council as to what that box should belong or shouldn't belong at this structure. So there's a lot of conversation about this, and I appreciate your perspective, honestly, because that brings a little more validity to this whole process. But there's a lot of conversation that has occurred at this level, and you're right. I mean, you key on the members of the Housing Action Team being embedded on all the many different layers, right? that was a source of conversation as well at the Regional Housing Council, because if they are part of reviewing the applications and providing recommendations for funding to the Regional Housing Council, if they're gonna be part of the Regional Housing Council as a board, they shouldn't be voting on that, and that was the decision they eventually ended up at the Regional Housing Council. So there is a lot of structural elements that needs to be clarified on the roles and responsibilities. But I have to credit to Tom and Keely, because this is really the result of a lot of conversations. I was here in a meeting with all the housing action teams of nonprofits, full room, as to how we start vetting this new structure, how it should be, how we can get them involved and everything else, so.
So can somebody just, as an example, explain to me setting aside the lived experience steering committee, the two other advisory boards, why do they're listed the same, I mean, at a high level, it lists the same people, HAT, staff lead, other subject matter experts. Why do they need to be different? What are they doing that's separate? What was the discussion that led to the necessity of that? One's related to home fund and.
Yeah, you key right on it, is the affordable housing is the home fund.
Okay.
And the homeless services is the rest of the funding that deals with it. Because you, for instance, you see, you go through the process of issuing requests for proposals. And the request for proposals has many different funding sources that addresses many other elements of the need in the community. And those two really is clearly defined on the funding source.
Okay, but right now, who is providing decision-making and scoring? I sat for Hutch on the homeless services funding, and I had to read all the packets, and I had to score all the things as an elected official sitting on it wasn't the Regional Housing Council at that point, but it's the predecessor group. So now we've got, and the tech team was there, we had that, but that was it.
Right.
So why do we create, like, right in the middle of all this new complexity about the home fund and the lived experience committee, great. Why are we adding another layer underneath the tech team and the executive and the Rhc to deal with the advocate, to deal with the scoring and recommendations for the homeless services funding?
Yeah, and that is a good question, and again, I don't want to dismiss those concerns, and this is an opportunity really to give you a little bit of history as to how this came to be. Because even at the Regional Housing Council, when the applications were received, the tech team was the one who was reviewing the applications, scoring, and providing recommendations to the Regional Housing Council.
Well, it's the financial committee, because I got just for.
So, and there was only a representative, an elected official on those as a request. So, because this become a little more complex, meaning in terms of, and how we need to engage some of the subject matter experts into that decision-making process, that's how this came to be. So at this point, we don't have, let's say, an elected official going through the scoring of the applications and providing recommendations. That's done at this level. And the tech team is the one who brings and funnels all that to fully recommendations to the Regional Housing Council. That's a fundamental change to what you experience. Because I think what you referring to is a small portion of this funding that it was assigned to that. It was, I think it's recording fees. The Commissioner Hutchins, you were part of that reviewing the applications. This is everything.
But the home fund.
But the home fund.
And why is the home fund council called the Affordable Housing Council? Home fund is about permanent supportive housing and mental health and behavioral health at a low income, lowest income. It's not really an affordable housing.
You know, those are
That's a much broader
those
group,
are labels,
term of art, right?
terms, and that can probably, we can bring recommendations as to how those subcommittees should be named. This is still a proposal.
Okay. Well, I thought this briefing was about kind of giving 2 cents, so I'm just kind of
No, absolutely, no, appreciate
I'm
that.
not saying I'm right about anything.
I really
can be-
appreciate
Feel free to argue with me,
I
but
appreciate everything. We're trying to bring you up to speed in a way, so this has not been developed
overnight. I think has been a source of many conversations in the
Many
regional housing
heated
trust.
conversations.
Many
Yeah.
conversations, so.
And I would say just on that naming, the home fund, because that affordable housing board does include more things than just the home fund. It does include some of the federal home, that it's the home fund plus. And so that's why but the name, we're happy to kind of take ideas on the name, if that's confusing.
I note that whatever slide number this is, where the two committees, there is actually a list of the different types of funds that are gonna go to each. So that's helpful to me. I still think it's a lot to have two totally separate.
So is it okay to have, the advisory board connected to the home fund is like part of the legislation. That's mandated. And is it okay to have it now just subsumed to a tiny fraction? I'm exaggerating, but a smaller fraction of a work group that's now gonna work on $1,406, $2,060, the home dollars. Now you've only got, a half of a home fund advisory group, or a third of or a quarter of a home fund work group, because you've added all these other funding streams to it. Is that permitted by the law? As long as there's some advisory work group that has a responsibility to think about it, it's okay? I thought we had to have a dedicated work group for home fund.
So I don't know about the new home fund that we just have voted in, but I can tell you that most funding sources from the state and the feds encourage an integrated approach. So, so you can talk about how the total money available is gonna be used to support the system, not only their little piece of it. So in that respect, unless Tom's aware of something that requires a dedicated committee, every funder I've ever worked with appreciates a more global.
Yeah.
Thank you, Robin, because that was the premise of this, really, if you think. Because if we were to look from a specific funding source, you're absolutely on point. But this provides the opportunity to look all the different funding sources to make a larger impact. Whether it's a project, whether it's a program, by having a consolidated funding sources that we can look holistically as to how we can make a larger impact. That is the genesis behind this, in a way. And the same on the homeless, because we have issue in award grants on a yearly basis, on a programmatic basis, on an individual request, as opposed to just looking holistically as to how we can make a larger impact in the system.
I mean, to that very point, why would you split these up? Instead of taking a more holistic approach, and at one point, the discussion, not in this most recent iteration of a housing regional committee, but over the years, one of the approaches that was talked about is that the committee would set the policy and select the projects, and you'd let a technical staff group determine which funding streams to pull from to achieve the goals of the community. But here you're splitting it along funding lines.
Keely has her hand up. Go ahead, Keely.
I can answer that. I think I can answer at least a part of it. So since I came on board and in 2019 and had to start the drafting of the 5-year homeless crisis response plan, there is a homeless crisis response plan work group, and that work group continues to meet on a quarterly basis over the last several years to monitor the homeless crisis response plan, to look at our strategies, to address whether we're meeting them, et cetera. And so that basically is what this is, just formalizing it. The part that's been missing from the tech team, although a very thorough group of people making funding recommendations for these funding resources, is that specific to homelessness, is that I represent subject matter expertise because of my background, and that's it. And so the idea is, in the ways that the Home Fund Advisory Board does have subject matter expertise across that field, in that group making policy and funding recommendations, the same would be so for the homeless crisis response system, because it's a whole nother level of nuanced programming, et cetera. So it's kind of a divide and conquer, but also there's a lot of criticism from affordable housing advocates that most of our conversations at these meetings is focused on homelessness.
Mhm.
So not an intent to silo, and not an intent to create more work, but rather to have that focus and expertise that has actually been functioning. It just hasn't been formalized. So I don't know.
Yeah, and that is a good point, Keely, to follow up on that, on your question, 30,000 per level absolutely makes sense. And even on the initial conversations with some of the members of the Regional Housing Council, the concern was, if you have a single advisory committee, all the resources will be dedicated to homeless response. And there is a strong, obviously, desire to start working on affordable housing, because there's never going to be enough money to do both, to address entirely both. So there's a little bit of that component that occur in the initial conversations, but I don't disagree with you. The 30,000 per level absolutely makes sense. But start getting it down to the details, some of the conversations, the feedback. That's how it comes to be.
And the other thing I would just add, and I hope we can move to the other kind of topic because I know we're out of time, is just from a pure kind of workload management. I know Commissioner Menser, when you were on the CIP kind of reviewing those applications, at that point we had $7 million and we had kind of 50 or so applications. You know, moving forward, we're going to have $20 million, and you know, just the workload of reviewing those applications is going to be pretty substantial. And so kind of that dividing and really kind of separating out the specific expertise on the capital projects that have specific kind of subject matter experts versus the services side. So that was some of the thinking. Just having one group, a fear of just the vast amount, the workload that would be required felt overwhelming for the amount of resources coming.
Did that, Commissioner Menser, did that kind of?
We can move on.
Okay, so with that, we'll move on to the proposal.
All right, thank you. And I'm going to turn this over, and we're going to walk through. I know we have a slide packet you received. We're going to walk through. We're going to skip some of these slides as we did before.
Specifically,
Yep.
skip slide number 9, please.
Yes, we did see that.
Don't even touch base on that one yet.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yep, we hear that. Thank you. So I will share my screen again and let Jacinda walk through kind of this proposal. All right, Jacinda.
Good morning, commissioners. Jacinda Stelchis. So we are presenting a plan or a proposal for the Franz Anderson site. Just a little bit of background. This is 6 parcels. It was purchased with ARPA funding in partnership with City of Olympia earlier this year. And it's a fairly large, about 6-acre project. Thanks, Tom, for that map. So the current goals, next slide there, for the property through the right-of-way initiative, a tiny home village funded on the east side of the property. And then this proposal will touch on that west side of the property. The more, if you've been out there, it's a kind of more wooded side at the moment for permanent supportive housing. So just kind of a very brief reminder, in September of last year, the Regional Housing Council passed the permanent supportive housing framework. And that goal of that framework is to support through funding 150 to 200 permanent supportive housing units, fund those, not build those, but fund those by year 2024. We have also heard in our office from the state as recently as yesterday that permanent supportive housing is a large focus for the state, and will continue to be a large focus for the state moving forward in coming years. So the proposal today for that west side of the property is for permanent supportive housing, approximately 40 to 70 multifamily rental units. The proposal is for low-income single adults. The thought is to have a continuum of care from the tiny home village over to the other side of the property to kind of more supportive and permanent housing. And the design would essentially be kind of worked out and finalized through a request for proposal process that would be issued by Olympia, and I'll cover that a little bit later in terms of the time frame that's being proposed. So the estimated cost would be about 20 to 25 million. That cost is based on what we've seen the last few years for a 40 to 70 unit project. So why this project? Why now? Again, this is property that the county and Olympia currently own. That's a huge plus. Land accounts for about half of the project costs, and so that's something we should definitely keep in mind. There's a need in the housing market. There are at least 2 senior projects, low-income senior homeless projects that are proposed, will likely be moving forward in the next few years. And Family Support Center has now started on their family project. So there really is a need for that single adult development as well. Again, this is permanent supportive housing that's being proposed, so it's likely to score high in terms of state funding processes. The project is a great location and close to bus lines and such. I think we can kind of skip this slide. Thanks, Tom. So timeline that's being proposed, as I mentioned, staff and with Olympia and the county staff have kind of laid out what it would take to make this happen. And that timeline essentially looks like a request for proposals being released in February of 23, offering essentially the land and a desire for 40 to 70 permanent supportive housing units. Selecting that developer by May of 23. So time for them to respond and select. And then that June to December timeframe of this coming year, securing additional funding. So this is a project, even though we own the land, permanent supportive housing, any housing is expensive, and state funding will be necessary, whether that be housing trust fund, low-income housing tax credits, or both. So there's a time frame there to attract and secure additional funding. January through July is a permitting. Hopefully it doesn't take that long, but certainly there's an amount of time associated with permitting. And then it would be approximately 15 to 18 month construction timeline. So a proposal of a June 2026 occupancy date. Yeah, you can, thanks, Tom. So again, things to consider when we're talking about housing, especially in this market. State funds are needed. They're essential, whether that be housing trust fund or low-income housing tax credits or both. And in order to get something essentially developed and ready to be occupied by 2026, and that really does require seeking those funding sources in this next coming year. So it's very important to kind of get started on that process. Again, our permanent supportive housing framework that was adopted called for 150 to 200 new units funded by 2024. That framework also identified 8 to 20 million in regional ARPA funding as a potential source. And I think, Tom, you can move to the bottom here. I know we don't want to discuss too much funding sources, but I will say that the sooner, I guess, we can get started on the planning and releasing that RFP to select a developer, the better. And I will additionally kind of add that there are other projects that we are aware of that will be seeking state funding in the next year, including likely Lehigh's project to convert the hotel being acquired through the right-of-way initiative to permanent housing as well. So the more we can eliminate competition with ourselves, the better. And the more local funding that is invested in a project will elevate our chances of getting state funding for hopefully 2 projects. And then again, Treasury's requirements for ARPA funding are listed here. We can touch on those if needed or desired. But I think the outline here is a plan for permanent supportive housing on property that's already owned.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tom.
Okay, with that, questions, Commissioner Edwards?
Well, we're going to try this again. Can you hear me okay now?
Yeah, much better.
Okay. No, I'm gonna defer those to a later day. I agree with Commissioner Menser though on his questions about, are we setting ourselves up for an overburdening bureaucracy, I guess is what I'm going to say. Anyway, but as far as this whole thing for over at Franzen and whatnot, you're not going to be able to answer my questions in the next 3 minutes. I've got to get back into this other meeting. So more to come, I think. Thank you very much, though, for the presentation.
Commissioner Menser?
So I'm curious, like, we acquire this, we used ARPA funding, we're gonna apply for state funding to get construction, 25 million. All that happens, wonderful. I'm curious about the financial structure over the long term. Who, like the government owns the land, we're gonna use government money to construct it, but then what happens? Who owns these buildings for the future?
The operational aspect, is that what you
Well, and ownership and I mean, there's not public housing
Right.
purchased by like.
So the key element will be to find a nonprofit to help us manage, because you're right, I don't think the government should own those facilities.
So briefly,
Go ahead.
sorry, Commissioner, I do want to make sure that to make kind of go back up in the presentation here, and sorry if it wasn't very clear. The plan is to put out a request for proposal, and essentially through that request for proposal, we would identify a developer that would essentially we would gift or sell whatever the land, and they would take on the development of that project, which is a fairly common approach to developing land that the government currently owns.
Right.
So it would not be the government that owns
We
it.
would not gift the land.
No, the land has to remain in the public. I mean, we offer the land for them to develop at no cost. But the land,
There will
we
be no
cannot,
gifting.
we cannot just give the land, that's a good point. So we go through this process, we have to make sure that is the case.
Right, but overall, I think you're absolutely correct that it would probably be approached like other affordable housing, that a developer would build it and own it under certain covenants for using this type of money, and then operationally, who would do the supportive piece operationally?
Well, I think we need to look into a third party. In this case, as you know, on the hotel concept, the right of way.
Right.
We really have a Lehigh in this case who's gonna be help us manage that, because you're right. Government shouldn't be owning those units.
And how would we then pay for that on an ongoing basis?
I see both Jacinda's and Tom's hands up.
Just because I have the same questions Robin just asked. Permanent supportive housing, according to the definition in your slide 5, is subsidized leased housing. So who's subsidizing this and the services, and how involved are we like 10 years down the road?
Go ahead, Jacinda.
Yeah, so part of that RFP process is both the developer, whoever is selected to develop the property, is taking on ownership in terms of developing and operating. I didn't touch, just because of time, on the specific slide in here in the presentation around operations. This is permanent supportive housing, so there would be a minimal rent associated, and then there are several potential funding sources, operational funding sources, such as Apple Health and Home, that could be available. Essentially, though, it would be that developer who takes on the project that is figuring out how to sustain it. And that's a fairly common model. It's something that they would be, considering before they apply to the request for proposals.
We already have a model. What is the name escapes me. Right from the nearby the inner city transit offices.
Yeah, and that's what I was gonna. The
Yeah.
Unity Commons.
Yeah.
Is a very similar. That was land that Olympia purchased. Olympia purchased that property and then went through an RFP process and selected
Right.
Lehigh and Interfaith Works. So this would operate very similar to kind of the way Unity Commons is currently structured, or potentially. Olympia owned that land, Lehigh developed it, they operate it. The subsidy comes from, building, they don't have a $20 million mortgage that they need to carry because the construction costs. Therefore, the rent that is collected from the units can go in to support the operations of those units.
That is the
The
cost.
subsidy comes from really the paying for the construction of the property goes a long ways to reducing the operating costs and allowing the operating costs to be covered by primarily the rent that is collected.
I mean, most developers want to build something and move on, build something else. So Lehigh is a special organization that's specifically kind of geared at this model. Are there other ones out there like that? Is there a market for folks that are willing to build something and then be saddled with the operational obligations over a period of time? Or is Lehigh the only game in town?
Well, that is the purpose of their request for proposals.
We don't know.
Lehigh is not
Could be
the
others.
only game in
It could be
town.
others.
There are several others that are in the market, so to say, to build affordable housing. Lehigh is one. It's one that we're familiar with in this community. I've been doing affordable housing for 8 years, so it's not new. Catholic Community Services, Mercy Housing. There are others that are interested, and they are in this arena to serve a low-income population.
I do think that there's a big difference, though, between affordable housing and supportive housing.
So in this model and in this building, Unity Commons, I don't know if you have the chance to visit.
But that is
It's layered.
right.
And in fact, it has a little bit of shelter
Yeah.
on the first one, and then moves up into the building. And those are nice units. But it was just funny because this week it was a big article. In Pierce County, Tacoma is moving in that direction to purchase motels and just convert them into affordable housing. And they're not gonna be on it. So the model was already there. And Jacinda stated many others, she used the names of the many others, but the request for proposal is gonna give us the information that we need. But that's the model. The Unity Commons is the model that we're looking for. Local jurisdictions own the land. And that is the most expensive, really investment for anybody who wants to develop that. And if some of the jurisdictions, including the county, invest on that, during with ARPA funds, that's probably part of the conversation that we continue to have with the board. And then grants, that's exactly how the Unity Commons was built. and was constructed. It was a state grant, it was, the county contributed the last leg of that, it was what, $1 million, so they really put that project into the finish line to be constructed. So, and that is really, again, that's the model that we envision in this particular location. And in parallel to that, across the street, on this same, is gonna be a series of tiny homes. So is that the complementary, this particular piece of property provides, I think is gonna bring a lot of value down the road. But we need to work through the financial elements. Yeah.
We're out of time. I mean, I'm still curious about, I mean, I think it's great. I'm just curious, how does the money work? I mean, how does what are we getting into over the long term by
All fair questions.
making these investments, and how are the small amounts of rent sustaining the permanent supportive, and then this developer, what are they getting out of it? Why do they want to be involved? Maybe they're a nonprofit and they're doing it out of the goodness of their heart, but if we're talking about RFP, when I hear about developers, I'm thinking of folks that will have a profit margin they'd like to make, and where does that profit come from? If it's all subsidized and low rents and covenants not to, raise the rent and all that. And then how much falls back on Thurston County? I'm just trying to sort it all out.
No, it is all good, but I think a lot of the answers to those questions will be going through the request for proposals. If that request for proposals doesn't bring a return to what we're looking for, because if that request for proposal, a proposal binds the county or any other jurisdiction on the long term, it's not a viable approach, right? And you're absolutely on point. We need to make sure that investment has long-term benefits to the community, but not necessarily binding the county and an unknown financial situation.
Jacinda?
Thank you, Commissioner. Just wanted to offer, if anyone, I guess just throw out the invite if anyone wants to have a deeper conversation outside of this context where we have a limited time, just to talk about affordable housing and the financing sources that usually go into it and what the developers essentially get out of it. I'm happy to have those conversations.
I'd like to, because I've heard, I don't know if my seatmates, but I had meetings with people who are advocating some model they're using in Grays Harbor, where they create they basically create housing. They take only Medicaid folks that qualify for behavioral health. They have a whole bunch of behavioral health services embedded in it, and that basically pays for the housing. And you basically get as a byproduct like housing, because you're basically providing a behavioral health service and using that funding stream. And people are like, why aren't you doing that in Thurston County? And I was like, I don't know why we're not doing it in Thurston County. All this finance stuff is not my, my area of expertise. So how something like that fits with what's going on at UDD Commons versus buying hotels and managing those, I'd love to hear more about how that all works. So I would take you up on that, Jacinda. Maybe the board would like to hear it.
Yeah, maybe just organize a follow-up briefing specifically on some of the models that you're familiar with, what the models that exist in some of the developers, quote unquote developers. They may be interested in how the financial model works for them.
And then another piece, and that I'm just going to throw it out there, is I'm sure my seatmates have heard the same as me, that there's a lot of our housing authority, there's a lot of alternative approaches that they could take that they don't take, that also finance in other communities affordable housing projects. So I'd like to hear more about that, because that's not, again, I just heard it from people in the community. I don't know how it all works, how it fits together.
Thank you.
Yep.
Well, thank you, Tom. Thank you, Jacinda, and thank you, Keely, for these two very heavy presentations. I know that these are two very heavy subjects that many conversations have occurred over the past year just on these two, and Trying to fit it into an hour is not easy, but I appreciate you and all the hard work that you do. With that, we are adjourned.
Thank you.